I'm reading from 1 Samuel 15, verse 1. Samuel also said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So Saul gathered the people together and numbered them into line, and Saul came to a city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. So when I read this, it really threw me off. Again, these are questions that sometimes really give us a hard time to understand God. But then again, I'm noticing that all the questions that I wrestle with have to do with God's sovereignty. They have to do with God's holiness. They have to do with the fact that his ways are not our ways. Because if we can only evaluate God from a human perspective, can you imagine the created trying to analyze the creator? I mean, I don't even have to go beyond that. We are created beings. God has chosen to reveal how he does some of the things he does, and the things that he hasn't, God remains good. But we still have to dig in his word to find the reason for some of the things that he has done. And this one puzzled me, first of all, because I know that God is big on forgiveness, but here he seems to have kept something so much that he said, I remember what they did, go back and punish them for it. And I was surprised to find that this is not the only place where it says it. He kept reminding the children of Israel, at least on 2 different occasions, saying, remember what Amalek did. Make sure you remember. Make sure you do not forget. He had this information passed from generation to generation. And now the time for their punishment had come, now that there was a king and he was being sent forth to perform God's vengeance. This had me wonder, how do you know when you're performing revenge just for yourself as opposed to you are God's divine instrument to another? That brought up a whole other question, which really the answer ended up being about the condition of your heart, the state of your heart. And first of all, there's also the position that you hold, because God's not going to send just one person to another. Even in this case, it wasn't just anybody, it was a king that was sent to avenge. So we can't be out here willy-nilly saying, God sent me to exact vengeance against you because you did this to me. No, if you're not in an appointed office, let's not even worry about that. All right, so going back to this reading, actually, let me read you what had come up with as I was journaling, and then we'll probably come across all the other verses I was talking about. So in Exodus 17, this is right after the children of Israel had left Egypt, and now they were making their way across the Red Sea and into the wilderness. And now they were out in the wilderness. After the Israelites escaped Egypt and crossed the Red Sea, they camped at Rephidim in the wilderness. It was here that the Amalekites attacked them. Exodus 17:8 says, the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. This attack was unprovoked and particularly cruel because it targeted the weak and vulnerable at the rear of the Israelite camp. And this is according to Deuteronomy 25:17-18. So Moses directed Joshua to lead the army against the Amalekites, while Moses prayed on a hill with his hands lifted, holding the staff of God. With God's help, Israel defeated the Amalekites. After the victory, God declared, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under the heaven. He said this in Exodus 17:14. So back to Deuteronomy 25:17-19. It reads, remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. God reminds Israel of what the Amalekites did and why they deserve judgment. When you read this chapter, it really shows, listen, they attacked all who were lagging behind, the weak, the weary, the old, probably the maimed. They had no mercy. They didn't even have the courage to fight some sort of strong-ish ones. They were actually attacking the weakest in the group, and that was such an abomination before God. They preyed on the tired and vulnerable instead of fighting honorably. So this highlights the Amalekites' cruelty. Yeah? They had no fear of God, attacking a people under his protection. So again, we can see they were godless. God instructed Israel to destroy the Amalekites completely as an act of divine judgment. You shall blot out the name of Amalek from under the heaven. Do not forget. This is in Deuteronomy 25:19. God actually reminded them, do not forget. So don't be out here messing about with God, because you don't want his wrath to fall upon you. Look, they thought they were getting away with it, because we live in a society where all the systems are set up to prey on the weak. God is watching. God avenges for the weak. God avenges for the widow. He avenges for the fatherless. He avenges for the refugees. Let's be careful how we treat people. Let's be careful with the systems we set in place, because God is not to be toyed with. We might get away with it for so long that we think this is acceptable. We even begin to think it's godly. It's not godly. God is clear in his word that he's always watching for the weak. He's watching for the weak. So the Amalekites were continuously hostile towards the Israelites. The Amalekites remained persistent enemies of Israel throughout their history. Their aggression wasn't isolated to this one incident. They repeatedly opposed Israel and sought their destruction. So when we get back to the 1 Samuel 15 incident, this is God fulfilling his promise. Remember, he had told them, do not forget. He had said, I will blot out their name. So here, finally, the time is full, and God is now meting out judgment using Saul and the Israelites to punish the Amalekites for what they had been doing to Israel all this time. The command was to utterly destroy the Amalekites, leaving no survivors, including livestock. This may seem harsh, but it reflects God's justice against a nation that had repeatedly sinned and persisted in godlessness and violence. And here are the examples of that. When we go to Numbers 14, from 43 to 45, we find that after Israel's disobedience at Kadesh Barnea, the Amalekites joined forces with the Canaanites to attack the Israelites as they attempted to enter the promised land without God's blessing. This was after they had refused to go in because they had received a bad report, and then God had finally said, fine, I'm done with it. You're fine out here. And then Moses had confronted them that you'd refused to trust in God, you refused to take the promise, and then they were like, oh, we're so sorry, we're gonna go now. And Moses was like, don't do it, abort mission, and then they went anyway. That's what that verse is referring to. That's when they were beaten back. And then again in Judges 3:13 and Judges 6 from 3 to 5, we see that the Amalekites allied with other enemies of Israel, such as the Moabites, the Midianites, to raid and oppress Israel during the time of the Judges. So they were really a persistent enemy. And then we see again in 1 Samuel 30 from 1 to 19 that later during Saul's reign, that's when David and his men were living at Ziklag, the same Amalekites again raided and burnt the city down, capturing women and children. And this is when David prayed to God, should I pursue? And God said, yes, pursue. And he was able to pursue, defeat, and recover everything. Now, again, back to obedience and things like that. Again, we know Saul was not very good at fully obeying what God had asked. So we find here too that Saul only partially obeyed God by defeating the Amalekites, but he spared King Agag and the best of the livestock, directly disobeying God's command for total destruction. This disobedience led to Saul's rejection as king. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. That is 1 Samuel 15, verse 23. And then that forced Samuel to personally carry out God's judgment, and he had to kill King Agag himself. And we see that Saul's failure to fully obey God allowed some Amalekites to survive because they continued to trouble Israel even after this incident. If we read 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 8 to 10, an Amalekite claims to have killed Saul, though this may have been fabricated. And that's when David said, how dare you put your hand on God's anointed? And then again, they come up in the book of Esther, chapter 3, verse 1. Haman, the villain in Esther's story, is identified as an Agagite, likely a descendant of Amalekite King Agag. So we can see that the Amalekites were judged not just for their past sins, but also for their ongoing hostility and rebellion against God. God's timing in executing judgment is always perfect, though it may seem delayed from a human perspective. This judgment shows the seriousness of sin and rebellion, especially against God's people and God's purposes. God is really long-suffering when it comes to giving us an opportunity to repent. Despite the Amalekites' initial attack in Exodus, God gave them centuries before executing judgment, showing his patience and giving them time to repent. But because of human failure, in this case Saul's disobedience in not fully carrying out God's command, it reflects the broader issues of human failure to follow God's instructions fully, often leading to further consequences. So bottom line, the Amalekites were judged by God because of their unprovoked attack on Israel when they were at their weakest, And also their attack on the weakest of these. They didn't have honor. They didn't go to fight the people that were up front, that had more strength. They waited for those that were lagging behind, and unprovoked, they just attacked them. God is not to be toyed with, especially when it comes to his people. So let's be careful how we treat the disenfranchised. Okay, bye.